Hello there, welcome, come, have a seat by the fire. Hungry for some more lore, eh? Curious to hear about the dragons and how they would establish themselves on the world we heard about last time? Well, curiosity plays a very big part of this next story, so you're already in the right mindset. Really quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who checked out my last video. The outpouring of support and eagerness for the second episode was really encouraging to hear and has motivated me to keep going full steam ahead with this lore series. Same as the last time, I'll be using a selection of photos to help visualize the story. Some will be generic stock photos from the internet, and other will be official Conquest art. I'll be marking the official art with the Conquest logo in the bottom corner so that you can easily tell which is the canon art that's used to represent the game. Now, get yourself comfortable, but not too comfortable. There's dragons afoot. But let's start with a really quick recap before we get into the next chapter. There was a great argument between the first two beings, creation and destruction. Destruction was severely wounded by his brother before he shattered creation into billions of pieces. Their third sibling, Balance, was born and encased destruction in a prison of stone and Balance's own life force, thus forming the world. Creation and destruction's essence would still leach into reality, and the four horsemen were spawned. Their battles raged across the surface of Balance in an endless back and forth struggle. In the midst of this primordial war, life was born on Balance and was nurtured with the last of Balance's power to flourish over the face of the planet. Eventually, beings made of both creation and destruction, the dragons, would descend upon the Primordial War and put an end to it, defeating and imprisoning famine, war, and death, and shattering conquest upon the surface of the world. The shattering of Conquest heralded the end of the Primordial War and gave way to a new age. Intensely curious beings, these first dragons swarmed across Balance and reveled in its beauty. In their ancient tongue, they named this planet Aya, for the vast waters that flowed on its surface, a sight they had never encountered before in all their travels of the cosmos. But for all the beauty of the planet, the real wonder remained the advent of life in their eyes. They quickly realized they were simply too vast, too massive, and too powerful to truly witness its miracle. Beings that had once roamed the cosmos, sailing the solar winds deep in the void, simply cannot focus on something as minute as a leaf or an insect, much less the microorganisms they were delighted to discover. The most adventurous among their kind found a way to overcome this limitation. They crafted for themselves bodies made of the primordial elements of Balance, earth, air, fire, and water, and poured their consciousness into these new forms. However, no physical form could contain the vast might of these beings, and a large amount of their essence dissipated into the ether. But the experiment was a success. Possessing bodies forged of the elements allowed them to interact directly with the world and the life they found swarming across it. Following the success of these first few pioneers, the vast majority of dragons chose to forego their immaterial form and be clad in a body, with little concern for the power that was lost in the transition. The enemy, they reasoned, had been defeated. The reduction in their individual might did not present a threat. While they still scoured the remnants of the abyssal host off the surface, nothing remained that could even dream of matching their power. Even so, from among their numbers, 2 were chosen to forego the pleasures of incarnated existence, retaining their full power to better safeguard existence from threats unknown. They would sacrifice their enjoyment that their brethren might fulfill their dreams. For eons, dragons roamed the surface of Ea, watching life evolve into progressively complex forms and develop increasingly diverse ecosystems. Their bodies, however, forged as they were from the elements of balance, did not grow, change, or adapt. As millennium piled upon millennium, the dragons grew restive. They did not simply want to observe life, they wanted to experience it. To this end, they strove to forge bodies of increasing complexity, moving away from their primordial heritage and closer to the web of life. Soon, their bodies incorporated not only the four elements in different balances, but the very essence and substance of balance itself. Across millennia of experimentation and exploration, the dragons slowly wove living bodies for themselves. Alas, once more, these forms were too delicate to contain even their diminished power, forcing them to surrender even more of their original primordial might. Despite their best efforts, dragons could never overcome the limitations imposed by their primordial origins. Their bodies mimicked life in all ways but one: procreation. When two dragons mated, the result was a lesser Draco form, a drake, physically powerful and imposing, but nonetheless possessing only animal-level intelligence and none of the sorcerous gifts of their parents. The birth of a true dragon from mating required both mates to sacrifice a portion of their essence to imbue the egg with it. Thus quickened, a fertilized dragon egg would hatch a being greater than the sum of power of both parents had imbued in it, but weaker than its sires. Each generation of dragons was thus weaker than the one that had preceded it. It was through this process of surrender and dilution that the cosmic beings that fought in the Primordial War become the dragons that we know today. For uncounted millennia, they dominated life on Ea, waging a one-sided war against the remnants of the abyssal host and the proto-cultures that they corrupted to their dark power. To this day, cyclopean ruins of these dark civilizations can be found dotting the landscape, millennia of neglect and erosion doing little to dispel the aura of evil so pervasive even scouring dragonfire could not eliminate it in its entirety. It was this, the Age of Dragons and their nurturing efforts, that allowed life to flourish in the variety and complexity that it did on Ea. The peace the dragons offered on what had once been the battlefield of cosmic entities was paramount for balance, to preserve Destruction's prison and lulling him into an ever deeper slumber. But the cosmos was still the result of the never-ending conflict between opposite forces, and the peace on Ea would soon be challenged from a quarter that nobody expected. It's not known for certain, but it's assumed that in a distant corner of the cosmos, another celestial body had become a host to life as well, perhaps mirroring the circumstances of the conflict on Ea. But in the absence of balance, life there was shaped under the baleful influence of a maddened shard of creation. From this alien place came the first Exiles, creatures of a cosmos of balance, but not made from it. The first Exiles to set foot on Ea were explorers and scholars. They had been funded by the richest and most powerful of the noble houses, which still had funds to spend on anything but their survival. Confident in their victory on their home world's turmoil, they were keen to lay the groundwork for future expansions. Their earliest presence, therefore, was contained to a series of small, living structures, precursors to the mighty spires scattered throughout the surface of Ea. This slow pace of development and expansion allowed these original spires to escape the notice of the dragons. Only a few hundred years later, however, things changed. Exile presence on Ea increased drastically, only this time these were not scholars or explorers, they were soldiers, workers, and administrators arrived in the thousands, laying the groundwork for dozens of spires throughout the continent. Over the course of the next century, hundreds upon thousands of exiles would make their way over into this world, populating the massive spires that had been founded to house them. This massive population influx continued for decades until the Sovereign, last of the exiles to abandon the homeworld, crossed the ways and shattered them so that no one might follow them. In a single act, most of the remaining population of this race had been consigned to whatever fate awaited them at the hands of the enemy on their homeworld, while those who had made it to Ea had found themselves stranded on this planet. It comes to little surprise that, despite the absolute decimation of the exiles as a people, miraculously almost all the sovereign lineages had made it through, along with their soldiers and servants. The religious and artisan castes were also well represented among the surviving population that found a new home on Ea. Of the lowest castes, however, the soldiers and laborers, only a tiny fraction had been saved. While the Sovereign claimed that this was the result of a noble and desperate sacrifice born of necessity, the unavoidable cost of ensuring that the enemy could not pursue them into this new world, the religious leadership decried the act as one of desperation and waste, reminding the Sovereign that, had the ways been prepared and the foundations for this exodus had been laid earlier when they had first approached the Sovereign, countless more could have been saved. The lower classes saw this act as only another betrayal by the Sovereign. Accustomed as they were to privation and hardship, their outrage against this act faded, and as time passed, the workers and soldier castes focused on the task of rebuilding their shattered civilization. While the Sovereign congratulated himself on his foresight and daring in securing his unopposed power, deep cracks spread throughout Exile society, fatally undermining a social structure that had survived millennia of conflict against the unstoppable enemy. Trapped in a hostile environment with limited resources, the exiles were forced to turn once more to the gift of life binding, an innate ability to bond with other life forms and have them share gifts, strengths, and physical traits. Very little is known of life binding. The process itself is long and arduous, and to see results, one must wait for months, even years. In Exile society, life binding had been largely abandoned as a practical tool and had been relegated to a spiritual and ceremonial role under the purview of the religious caste. Deprived of the resources and crafts they had enjoyed on their home planet, the exiles did not consider this to be a constraint, and once more embraced life binding as a tool. While most understood the need for this, the Voice, the religious leader of the exiles, saw it as a defilement of their most sacred mysteries and decried it as a blasphemy. The cracks spreading through Exile society were becoming even wider. In a variety of forms that mirrored their environment, the spires spread throughout the world in the millennia that followed Exile colonization. Forced to turn once more to life binding and basic tools, Exile society was required to rely heavily on crude labor. Weakened and fragmented, the labor caste was granted coveted reproductive rights and set to this task. They took to it with an intensity that pleased the sovereign, but should have scared him instead. Through their relentless labor and sacrifice, new spires grew and spread throughout the land to house the burgeoning exile population. It was during this period of rapid expansion that the exiles first came to the attention of the dragons. While the exiles were aware of the lesser drakes, which had equally intrigued and plagued the early explorers and scholars on this planet, true dragons had thus far avoided contact with them. Following the Primordial Wars, the dragons had not been the only sentient race left on the planet. Time and time again, sapient proto-peoples would rise, but the remnants of the abyssal host were almost always universally faster to react to these developments than the dragons were. The abyssal host descending on the fledgling civilizations and corrupting them from within. By the time the dragons became aware of them, these cultures would have been so irredeemably corrupted that the only options the dragons had were to eradicate them. Countless primitive cultures turned to the worship of destruction and were cleansed by the dragons before they could truly grow or develop. However, when the exiles arrived, their alien makeup and absence of abyssal intervention forestalled the dragons from this extreme response. Calmer heads prevailed, and the dragons hid their presence from the exiles, observing and monitoring them until even the most suspicious among them were forced to agree that the exiles possessed no primordial taint, and thus were not a threat to them or Ea. However, time would prove them wrong on both accounts. Dragons had been the pinnacle of power and evolution on Ea for eons. Apex predators so far removed from the notion of a food chain that the only threats they faced were from each other. Over the eons, they had developed a complex social court, with leaders, etiquette, and forms to bind their innately competitive and prideful nature. The mystifying complexity of their culture was such that few mortals have ever been able to grasp, let alone master. The study of sorcery, their innate ability to manipulate the primordial forces, was also tremendously advanced. As each generation lost a portion of the primordial power the preceding one held, they sought through practice and application to overcome this inherent power disparity. What dragons never needed and thus never developed were tools, or the notion of material wealth beyond hunting grounds or even creature comforts. They were thus utterly unprepared for the devastating effect that this craving for material things would ultimately have on their society. This would be further compounded by a simple mistake in the envoys chosen to parley with the exiles. So confident were the dragons in their overwhelming power that they had chosen the envoys from their youngest and smallest members lest they frighten the exiles into precipitate action. These members, doomed to be the weakest of their draconic race, looked upon exiled tools, crafts, and weapons, and coveted them to bridge the gap between themselves and their elders. Instead of awing their counterparts with their raw power and majesty, the envoys shamed themselves through their venal behavior and undisguised greed. Unimpressed with the dragon envoys, the exiles dismissed these dragons as little more than animals, powerfully individually, but ultimately no threat to exile society and the massive spires that they had grown as a whole. Hostilities started soon after. The younger dragons, convinced of their superiority over any being but another dragon, made demands of the exiles and were met with insulting dismissal. Attacks on the spires soon followed, and these were repelled with impetuous ease. The young dragons were not deterred. They quickly turned on softer targets, caravans, and spire seed sites. Here they met with success, and the first casualties of the war were suffered. Convinced of their own superiority in turn, the exiles would not let this carry on for long. Traps were set, and retaliation soon claimed the first dragon life lost to another race in eons, escalating this conflict. The original dragon envoys displayed the wealth and power they had acquired from raiding the spires and recruited other young dragons for their mounting attacks. The Sovereign's response was immediate. Convinced of the folly of sharing the planet with another power so soon after the loss of their homeworld, and encouraged by the weakness and lack of cohesion of their enemy, the Sovereign decided to take the war to the dragons and end their threat once and for all. Massive forces were mustered, countless resources pooled and stockpiled. Weapons, armor, and supplies were sent to staging points and depots long before the armies marched. The largest army the Exiles had ever mustered was prepared, and with the root systems of the spires fully developed, manpower could be spared, thus ensuring that almost the entirety of the lower castes was induced to cooperate through coercion or promises of advancement. Thousands upon thousands of professional soldiers, supported by the conscripted menials and smiths, along with station masters and tenders, were drilled, trained, outfitted, and marshaled. With great fanfare, the greatest mortal host seen on Ea was sent forth to root out the dragons from their rooks, only to vanish, leaving behind the mangled bodies of the Sovereign's enforcers and psychopaths as proof of this mutiny. Patient as only immortals can be, the lower castes had laid the groundwork for both their freedom and their revenge over the course of 1,000 years. The surprise of their departure was total, its effect devastating. With but minimal bloodshed, the lower castes had carved the heart out of the leadership that had betrayed them and taken their destiny into their own hands. Without a word to their erstwhile masters, this quiet host reached the shores of the Great Sea and passed beyond memory and into myth. Now bereft of manpower and with their leadership shocked into turmoil, the previously invincible spires came under threat as the dragons, sensing the weakness of their enemy, intensified their attacks. Suddenly vulnerable, the Sovereign responded in panic, turning to an extreme cast of disenfranchised scholars and researchers who promised him a solution to all his problems. Disregarding the vehement objections of the Voice, he chose to embrace their perversion of life binding into their new craft, biomancy, to repopulate their decimated population with pliable, obedient underlings. This proved to be the final straw for the religious leadership. Taking advantage of the Sovereign's weakness, the Voice made a bid for power, revealing that she had been in contact with the dragons from the very beginning of this conflict. The Voice had beseeched the intervention of the very eldest and greatest of the dragons to end the war. Enlisting the aid of the artisan caste, she had succeeded in striking a deal with the elder dragons, one that denuded the spires of their arts, crafts, and artifices to satisfy the greed and pride of the dragon race. The plunder and craftsmanship of an entire world would be theirs, and in return, the dragons would bestow upon the Exiles vast forested lands where they could begin their life anew. Unrest spread through the spires as the remaining population, tired of the Sovereign's conflict and betrayals, and enticed by the notion of a new beginning, rebelled. However, with the same ruthlessness that had seen him cling to power, the Sovereign ordered his very first clone soldiers to put down this revolt. As thousands died beneath the spears of his remorseless creations, the Voice surrendered in person to the Sovereign, only to play her trump card by summoning 3 of the eldest dragons to the Sovereign's location. The Exiles had never beheld an elder dragon incarnate, The sudden appearance of these three godlike behemoths and a minor display of their overwhelming power was all it took to bring the sovereign to the negotiating table. While no official records exist of what transpired in this meeting, the results speak for themselves. Surprised, weakened by the defection of his people and forces, the sovereign could do little but capitulate. The slaughter of civilians stopped as the sovereign called for an end to this bloodshed. All who wished to leave could do so, with their wealth and possessions guaranteed until they reached the border of the new lands that the dragons had bequeathed. Following on the heels of the sovereign's massacre, response was overwhelming, and most of the surviving population of the spires chose to join the voice in this, the last exile. She, on the other hand, ensured that those who joined her understood that they must bequeath their wealth to start a new society under the eaves of the Great Forest. The wealth of an entire world found its way to the dragon's rooks. Left with no choice, the sovereign and his noble lineages had surrendered to the overwhelming power of the elder dragons. Ruthless and cunning, the dragons would exact one more concession from the sovereign, claiming that the previous agreement only covered those who followed the voice. A different deal would be made with the exiles who remained. In return for peace and a return to the status quo, the dragons would demand a different price: biomancy. With their entire society in shambles, their economy in ruins, and no population to speak of, that should have been the end of the spires and exile civilization, at least as it was interpreted by the sovereign. But this was the man who had defended his throne for millennia against countless ruthless rivals and survived the death of his own world. From the few resources he had left, he would build his society anew, reforging exile society into the spires that we know today. In time, the hubris and greed of the dragons would come back to haunt them, as their own biomantic experiments would yield their bitter fruit and doom this ancient noble race into extinction. And that's all the time we have for today. You got to learn about how the dragons sacrificed more and more of themselves so that they could craft physical bodies to live on Ea with, how they only got weaker and greedier as the ages rolled by, and the mysterious arrival of the Exiles, how the sovereign's greed and deceit would shatter their entire culture, fracturing its people into their own clans, with the lowest class disappearing across the ocean, and the rest of the population sacrificing all of their material wealth to live in the dense forests far, far away. In the next story, we'll learn more about the horrific art of biomancy and the horrors that the sovereign would unleash into Ea, with the dragons using it to create something that would change the course of life on Ea forever. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story I had to tell today. Anyone who knows me in real life knows that I absolutely adore dragons and depictures of them. I tried my best to just stick to stock photos for this video, but there weren't a lot of good pieces of dragon art, so I used a couple from my favorite artists on Artstation. Oasis Art Studio, Justin Gerard, Janice Mayer, Olya Chibrikova, Philip A. Ehrlich, Francisco Badilla, Claudia Schmidt, Afta Trahatma, Tati Lang, Andrew Andreev, Bruce Zhang, Fabian Pauli, Davy Rule, Godfrey Escoda, Julian Goche, Nick Haran, Antonio J. Manzado, Bayward Wu, and Imad Awan. I put their links in the description below. So please check out more of their work. They've got even more incredible fantasy-based art that will be sure to delight. And once again, we're a new channel here, so it would really help us out if you were to subscribe to us. And don't forget to shatter that like button. It helps the channel grow and gets our content out to more fans of the game, and maybe even into the hands of people who haven't heard of Conquest before. It's an incredible game with some of the richest lore I've read, so I really want it to do well and to flourish. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next video.